Good evening, everyone. My name is Murray Patterson. I am currently chairman of the Scottish branch of the PSPS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening on a talk of another paddle steamer which the Society has, perhaps a little bit less known, but nonetheless one well worthy and has its own story to tell. And it's my pleasure to invite you to join us tonight for a talk to be given by Captain John Megoran, who I believe, John, is that correct? You actually joined the Society back in 1962?
I did. My dad joined in 1960.
Well done to you. So really, a very senior member in terms of the time he's been in the Society. And he will tell us about his time with the Kingswear Castle. And he joined the team restoring it, and they brought it back into service after many tribulations in 1985. John then continued to be the master of the ship and the business, running the business of the Kingswear Castle on the Thames and on the Medway, right through until 2012. And of course, with the ship now operating in the River Dart, John liaises with the Dart Steamboat Company regarding the Kingswear Castle, which he takes a continuing and fatherly interest in. So it's my pleasure now to ask John to tell his story, and I hand over to you, and I'm sure we'll all have a very interesting and pleasant evening. John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you very much. Let's share my screen, and there we are. So we're going to talk about Kingswear Castle and her rebuild coming up. And we are hopefully going to move on to the next slide, which has yet to move on. I'm just waiting for the next slide to move on, which it seems to be rather slow at doing. Unless any of my technical advisors would like to give me an advice on this. I press the button for it going on, and it doesn't seem to want to go on. Oh dear. Perhaps if I stop sharing it and I start sharing it again. And let's start from the beginning. Success. Well, what we're going to talk about tonight is a little bit of KC's history, a little bit about operating KC. Then we'll move on to why we really need to rebuild any ship, our plan for KC, and why we need donations. And if anyone would like to donate, the ways for doing it, you can donate through our website, which is www.kingswearcastle.org. Note there isn't a .uk on it, it's just www.kingswearcastle.org. Or you can send checks to PO Box 9565, Weymouth DT4 4HT. But I will put these up again later. Well, Kingswear Castle is the last of a series of paddle steamers built to run on the River Dart. This is the Dartmouth Castle, built in 1904. And they all were much of a muchness, really, with plenty of open deck space, a little bit of saloon, so limited fare. They all had a very shallow draft, going up to Totnes. Totnes dried out, or nearly dries out at low tide. And they were all very lightly constructed. KC's hull is just made up of strakes of 6mm and 8mm plate, so it's not very thick. We're not looking at the structure of HMS Belfast here. And in some ways, a little bit like the Dresden paddle steamers to look at, and the shape's slightly different. The Dart paddle steamers had this curious canoe bow, but not dissimilar. And there were 3 paddle steamers running up to Dartmouth until the 1960s, the Compton Castle of 1913, 1914, the Totnes Castle in 1923, and Kingswear Castle in 1924. And in this picture, the two of them are at Totnes. And to help turning when there were two of them there, they sometimes used to make themselves fast alongside each other. One put one engine ahead and the other astern, and they twizzled around as though they were a twin screw ship. Also, as built, they had passenger certificates for 500 passengers. I mean, that's quite amazing, really, given the size of the ships. That was subsequently reduced to just over 400. But whilst they look fairly small, they're not quite as small, and Kingswear Castle not quite as small as she looks. I mean, she's 113 feet 8 inches length overall. Waverley's 239 feet. So Casey is about half the length of the Waverley. And if you look at Casey and you look at the Waverley, you would think that was not possible, but she is. The Totnes Castle was modified to carry cars so that she could fill in on the car ferry service run by the Great Western Railway between Kingswear and Dartmouth. And if you look closely in that picture, the landing gates just forward of the paddle box are much wider, so that you could drive a little car onto there and you could carry several on the foredeck. The Compton Castle still exists today. There she is pictured in Truro just before Christmas, looking rather sorry for herself and not exactly an immaculate historic ship. I hadn't seen her for some while before I went down, and I was surprised at how a number of things had gone. The last function was at a fish and chip shop, but that closed with COVID, and she hasn't reopened subsequently. The Dart business, though, in its heyday was absolutely a honeypot. With the 3 paddle steamers initially carrying 500 passengers each, plus the other boats in the fleet, that was putting a lot of people afloat at any one time on the river between Dartmouth, Kingswear, and Totnes. There she's just, or one of the 3 is just leaving or just left Diddersham. When we first started, I went down to Dartmouth and had a meeting with Captain Rieberg, who had been one of her captains on the Dart before, and I was asking him, trying to get information on how he handled her. And I remember one of the things he said was that the pier at Diddersham was always very difficult because where it was placed, the prevailing southwesterly wind funneling down the valley there onto the pier blew the paddle steamers off, so they had to get their ropes ashore double quick. So she was withdrawn in 1965. And she was then bought. Nick Knight was then the chairman of the PSPS, and he was a formidable character. I like Nick, very forthright, called a spade a bloody spade, and was one of those people who have an ability to drive daisies through concrete. And he, and also Tony McGuinnessy, another key PSPS member from the 1960s. He was a formidable influence. He bought the paddle steamer Consul and tried to run her in 1963 and 1964. And after that, set up a shipbroking firm which handled the sales of many paddle steamers, including the Jeannie Deans, the Bristol Queen, the Talisman, Cardiff Queen, etc. And he had a finger in pretty much every PSPS pie, including bringing the Ride up to London on a charter in 1969. But Nick was determined to buy KC, and he surveyed the ship. And around that time, my dad gave me a typewriter, and I remember to practice typewriting, I typed out the survey report of Kingswear Castle around 1965, 66, whenever it was. Well, the PSPS and Paddle Steam Navigation Limited, which owned KC on behalf of the society, didn't really know what to do with it. And so they chartered her out onto the Isle of Wight to the Redette brothers, then owners of the Medway Queen. They bought the Medway Queen and opened her as a bar and restaurant and dance club on the Isle of Wight at Binfield. And that's the first time I went aboard her. I went to have a look. I was 16 at the time, and I knew she was there, and she was afloat like that, and I couldn't figure out how to get on board, so I very naughtily purloined a dinghy I saw lying alongside somewhere and rowed out and returned the dinghy afterwards. She steamed a couple of times in the Isle of Wight years, but basically she was very neglected. subject to much vandalism. The glass windows with the nice etched glass of the castles, Kingswear Castle on it, they were damaged. And it was clear really that the restoration there was going nowhere. So then she came to Nick Knight's boatyard on the River Medway at Borstal. She was towed round and a team of volunteers got us stuck in and starting to do work. Really, they were working weekends only. Progress was very slow. And in 1972, there were thoughts that this was going nowhere and that she would have to be sold. But fortunately, a new project leader, Laurie Beale, hove onto the scene, and so she wasn't sold. And for the rest of the 1970s, work sort of continued, but I think it is characterized by the fact that there's no money in my house. There was no money for major works, and that really was the story of those years. There was competition for funds with the Waverley. The Waverley had just been acquired by the Society in 1974-75. And not surprisingly, people thought, well, it's better to give money to a going concern than to a paddle steamer that is not going at the moment. Some of the older members of the Society will remember Mrs. Eileen Pritchard. She was a formidable lady on the south coast, very much working for the Society in the best interest of the Society. I remember, and she was one of the trustees of paddle steam navigation. I know that she got very frustrated by the lack of money. But that spurred people on, and much was done on a make and mend basis with a lot of ingenuity. For example, they couldn't afford marine glue for the deck caulking, so they used road tar, which worked fairly well initially anyway. And then later in the 1970s, some money came. There's Nick Knight standing on Casey's foredeck waving a check for £500, which some money for the decks. There was also a small amount of money which was snapped up in controversial circumstances to do some doubling of the ship's hull plates. And then at the end of the decade, Babcock's came on the scene, really. And that was a game changer, that they provided equipment and expertise and raw materials. And the project really started to get going in the late 70s and on into the early 80s. Then by 1984-85, but by 85, she was in the state to renew the passenger certificates. Again, that would be a difficult thing to do today because the MCA take the view that if a ship's out of service for more than 5 years, it's treated as a new ship. That wasn't the case back then. And I think it's important to remember that that restoration really was done without any major investments. I mean, there were little bits of money and little bits of this, that, and the other, like for the doubling and such like. So it's immense credit to the volunteers to have transformed this ship into a ship that can go. And in 1984, she ran some trial trips with just 12 passengers. That was the first year I sailed as one of her captains. My two colleagues there, Colin Wright on the left was a Medway pilot and Dan Macmillan was a Thames pilot. And during that winter, 1984 to 85, Nick Knight persuaded me to join as the general manager and run the business and sail as the KC's captain. And that was 38 years ago, goodness. I put this in that running a paddle steamer, it's a different thing. Most people are not used to paddle steamers. And I think it's fair to say that whilst I had witnessed a lot of paddle steamers in my youth and had learned to steer on the Princess Elizabeth and the Jeannie Deans, I was a little bit green at the start, as one tends to be in these things. And one thing I couldn't figure out initially was why sometimes Casey wouldn't stop properly. I would ring full astern and she wouldn't stop, as I remembered paddle steamers stop. I also noticed that the engine wasn't turning before leaving piers. Well, I remember with Cousins, the engine was always turning dead slow at stern before. And I'd watched Alf Poe, the chief engineer on the Monarch and the Embassy, and Cyril Julian, the chief engineer on the Consul, handling their engines, and of course Ken Blacklock, the ace Ken Blacklock on the Waverley. And I was really helped by Harry Quirk there on the left. He hove into view with Maurice Marriott in the first season. Harry had been a chief engineer with Sealink at Dover, and Maurice was P&O's Marine Superintendent at Dover. And they really were a tremendously good influence on the engine room and the whole business of working as a team and stopping the engine in just the right place so it starts, and delivering full astern. I mean, when a captain of a paddle steamer rings full astern, he wants full astern now. He doesn't want half astern in 8 seconds time. So they were very good with that. And the reason for turning the engine over gently before leaving is Kingswear Castle's vacuum pump is engine driven, and paddle steamer engines need a vacuum in order to draw the steam out from the low pressure cylinder. If you don't have a vacuum, the engine just doesn't work, and you need to build that vacuum up before you go. And I was very lucky subsequently with Chris Smith, Nigel Thomas and Dan Wielden currently that they learnt these techniques, and like the Swiss became absolute masters of it. And just as one example of this stopping the engine in just the right place for getting it to go, Brian Jackson, who some people may remember, the late Brian Jackson, he was an apprentice with Cousins, and he was an apprentice put on the Monarch, and then on the console after the Monarch was sold in 1960-61. And I remember him telling me, and two things here. Firstly, when he went on the Monarch, Alf Pover, the chief engineer, said in his first week, well, the first week, what I want you to do is nothing but look around the engine room, go into every nook and cranny, every valve, everything else, and just spend your time looking at it and working out how it works. And on Friday afternoon, we'll sit down and have a cup of tea and a cake, and you can tell me how it all works. And I thought that was quite a good idea for getting people really to know what's going on. And the second thing that Brian told me, that he learnt to drive the engine of the Monarch. And this thing is stopping the engine in just the right place so that when you get full astern, you get a lot of push to get it going. And then the next show he was on the console, and he did exactly the same, and he got the engine stuck. And he couldn't initially figure out why he got the engine stuck until he suddenly realized that the console, bizarrely, had its high pressure cylinder on the left-hand side of the engine, whereas the Monarch had it on the right-hand side of the engine. Most paddle steamers, I think, tend to have it on the right-hand side of the engine, but the console was different, it was on the left. And that rapport is fundamental to paddle steamer handling. If you don't have that rapport, you can't handle a paddle steamer. The Swiss are masters of it, as I said, particularly given that you very often need to approach piers faster in a paddle steamer than you would do with another ship. And indeed, that is something which all mariners are taught today is not the way to do it. It's slow, 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 but not on a paddle steamer. So we got it back into service, and the bedrock of our business on the Medway was the afternoon cruises. These worked very well. They produced regular daily loads of up to 150, and they were real revenue generators, and they had low operating costs. Another thing that I'm sure you're all aware of is that the relationship between the amount of fuel you burn and the speed the ship goes is not a linear one. And getting that last 1 or 2 knots out of a ship bumps your fuel consumption up massively. KC has 4 valve settings for a head and 3 for a stern, with we call them cunningly 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 is the slowest, and number 4 is the fastest. And on number 1, the stoker engineer needs to put a little bit of coal in every now and again. On number 2, he has to do more. On number 4, he's hardly away from the furnace chucking coal in. It makes a massive, massive difference. And our afternoon cruises, generally speaking, we went everywhere on number 1 or number 2 occasionally. KC has low crew costs, a crew of 4. At one stage, I even managed to get it down to a crew of 3, but it's back up to 4 again, I see now. And these trips appeal to a wide range of market segments. Not so much the enthusiast market, but other markets, the sort of people who might take the family to Hever Castle one weekend and then might go for a trip on KC the next. We did some longer trips, for which in many ways, looking back, KC wasn't really very suitable. I mean, she was built for 1.5 hour trips up and down the Dart, and that's the facilities that she had. We went to Southend sometimes, although Southend was very weather dependent. And on the Thames estuary, the worst wind direction is from the east, blowing straight in up the estuary. And my heart used to sink on days when there was an easterly wind, because if you went across in the morning, let's say, and there was a flood tide, it was quiet as a mouse. But then the tide turned on days when it turned in the middle of the afternoon and started going against that easterly wind. Even moderate easterly winds of force 3 to 4, it turned it into a sort of maelstrom. So I think it wasn't an ideal trip for her, but we did it over the years. In terms of marketing segmentation, we found that sometimes the Southend trips produced a lot of drunks, rather like the Weebly going to Rothsay. But we found that running to Southend on a Thursday didn't produce so many drunks as if you went on a Saturday. So these things make a difference. But as a trip also, it was a long grind home back up the Medway. And she's not really designed for those sort of things. We went to Whitstable sometimes, again weather dependent, very exposed north of Sheppey, again with the wind against the tide. And because Whitstable is a tidal harbour, which dries out at low water, that inevitably meant by definition, whenever we went to Whitstable, we were punching the flood tide on the way out and punching the ebb tide on the way back. It's also quite a difficult harbour entrance, with the tides running across the entrance. In fact, I would say that once the ebb tide has started, you can't really get a paddle steamer in or out of the harbour. It just sluices across the entrance so fast. And of course, those were very long operating days. And as hours of work regulations came on, they became undoable with the sort of crew numbers that we had. We went upriver sometimes to New Hythe. One of the challenges there was a horseshoe bend, people may remember, which Casey just went round. But while she was going around, you didn't want to meet any boats coming the other way. One day we went up and there was an admiral's procession. The admiral of the river was coming down the other way with this large fleet of motorboats. And we went to London from time to time. As I say, she's not really suited for these very long trips and not really fast enough for the tides. If you look at that picture on the left, just look at that water sluicing past the London Bridge City Pier. In fact, when we moored there overnight, sometimes, there's a lot of driftwood on the Thames, and we would find that if we were portside too, like there, from the paddle wheel up to the end of the pier, the next morning was solid wood, which had just been collected in that gap. There were difficult days, these long days for catering, because we only had 2 refrigerators on the ship. And if you're going up to London and then doing something else there and something else there and then coming back, you need a lot of stock. And of course, there's no crew accommodation on KC. So people had to doss down in the saloons in sleeping bags. And apart from boiling a kettle, there was no running hot water. But they were interesting to do. Now, coming into operating a paddle steamer, Alan Robinson, as we all know, founded the PSPS. I got to know him quite well. I liked Alan, a nice quiet man. Had a great enthusiasm and a great mission to do something. And I've got enormous respect for him for, founding the society without which we wouldn't be here today. I think, though, it's fair to say that there was a lack of practical knowledge in the early days of the PSPS. And I remember Alan saying to me that he had thought that Cousins paddle steamers he knew at Bournemouth, they laid up each winter in Weymouth. They were given a lick of paint and then started at Easter the next season. And he said that with a smile, realizing, obviously, as the years went on, that an awful lot of other major work went on paddle steamers. But at that stage, he thought it didn't. And I think it's interesting that in the moment that he founded the PSPS, believing that the paddle steamers sat there in the winter doing nothing very much. In fact, that same winter, 1959, 1960, the Monarch at Weymouth was being given a new inner funnel. I remember walking around the harbour. I was only 8, 9 at the time with my dad. We were always walking around the harbour and we saw that scaffolding and what are they doing there, Dad? And putting in a new inner funnel. And that again identifies another of these important facts in ships, that the things you need to worry about, apart from the things you can see, are the things you can't see. And you can't see an inner funnel. Well, not unless you climb into the funnel, you can't. So how long do ships last? How long are they built for? And the fact is that generally speaking, ships, and particularly excursion ships like this, were built for a 25-year career. That was sort of the policy of the railway companies. They built them for 25 years and then they sold them on after that. Of course, you can extend a ship's life. It depends how it's looked after, whether you pay attention to the bilges and such like. It depends what stresses and strains they have out in the hurly-burly. I mean, in a seaway, in going through seas, the whole ship is stressing and straining. And KC, as you know, is very long and thin. There isn't a sort of binding superstructure over the top holding the whole thing together. And that's 113 feet from the bow to the stern, and therefore you're going to have wave patterns going down through the hull. So ships are stressed when they go to sea. And one of those stresses is, of course, inside the boiler. I mean, boilers are designed, or like it best, a nice flat surface, and not a lot of jiggling about. But a seagoing ship, you're getting a lot of jiggling about the water, and in extreme circumstances, particularly if the water level is not quite as high as you might want it, there's always a danger of exposing heating surfaces, etc. Another thing that extended the life of paddle steamers was wars. Both the First World War and the Second World War were very good for providing crocks of gold to refurbish paddle steamers which came back after the war. But to go back to this 25-year thing, the Merston is a good example of that. She was built in 1928 for the Southern Railway's Portsmouth to Ryde services, and she was withdrawn and scrapped in 1952. And so she had a 24-year career, and nobody wanted her after that. The Consul, going back to 1961-62, as I said, growing up in Weymouth, I was always walking around the harbour, initially with my dad and then on my own. And here the Consul's on Cousins Slipway. You could stand outside the slipway, just as in this photograph, and see the hulls of the hull of the Consul there. And in the winter 1961-62, I noticed there were lots of white circles painted on the hull. I wonder if they've been white circles on the hull for. So, Dad, what's that for? Well, this, of course, predates the widespread use of ultrasonics, etc. So they used to quite literally drill a hole in the hull and had special kit to measure the thickness. And that winter, there were a lot of drillings on the Consul's hull just to check its thickness. And the surveyor that year, and for the next 2 or 3 seasons at Weymouth, Len Mutton, I got to know a little bit in the 1980s. And he was full of lots of stories about the Consul and the embassy and the difficulties with these by then very elderly hulls, which had a cement wash in the bilge. And the purpose of the cement wash was to keep the water away from the steelwork. But with the ship working in seaways and with time, this was starting to crack up. And so Len wanted all the cement wash out from the bilges. And in 1962, the Consul was therefore restricted to run just in Weymouth Bay between Lulworth Cove and Portland Bill. And in 1963, Cousins sold her. But she was quite old. I just said that 25 years, and here's a ship that was built in 1896 and was still operating in 1964 and not scrapped until 1968. I got to know her very well, really, as a child. I sailed on her every week in the summer. And I liked looking at the rust. And you found at the start of the season, there was lovely paintwork everywhere. But halfway through the season, you'd see these rusty streaks everywhere. And my dad was a painter, so I did a little bit of painting when I was a child, which I had no talent for at all. And I used to like putting the little bits of rust in. And it didn't occur to me then that rust indicates decay. There's a picture of the embassy, and if you look closely, you can see along the bulwark there on the foredeck by the name Embassy, tons of rust. You know, there was a ship quietly corroding away in front of our very eyes. And just to finish with the Consul, a 72-year career, built as the Duke of Devonshire to run on the Devon coast from Torquay and Exmouth, in an area bounded by Plymouth in the west and Weymouth in the east. She went as far as the Dardanelles in the First World War. Then she was back on the Devon coast after the First World War, had a brief spell in Ireland, and she came back to the Devon coast and then was bought by cousins in 1938. So she had a major rebuild after World War One. She had a major work when cousins bought her in 1938. After the war, they thought they might scrap her because she was in such poor condition, but they didn't, and they did rebuild her in 1949. And then 16 years later, in 1964, that was her last season. So she had a 72-year career, but during it, she had 3 rebuilds. Ditto the embassy. The embassy built in 1911 as a Duchess of Norfolk for the railway Portsmouth service, Portsmouth to Ryde. They sold it in 1937. Again, we're back to this magic figure of 25, 26 years. And she was bought by cousins who were ever on the lookout for cheap boats. She was given a major rebuild after the Second World War and altered almost completely out of recognition. So she had a career of 55 years, in which she had 1 major rebuild in 1946. So again, you're back to that 25, 30-year lifespan. If you look at that picture, you can see a lot of orange speckling around the bow. Well, Captain Iliff, who was Master of the Consul from 1963 through to 1966, was ever looking for things to do in the winter. And the wind and weather strake is an area much subject to corrosion because it's always wet and is in the air. And so each winter he got into a dinghy and painted red oxide paint around the waterline of the embassy as his attempt to try to preserve the hull. And then by the middle of the season, the black paint they painted over the top started to wash off, and so the red oxide started to show through. And moving north to the Clyde, Jeannie Deans, doyen of Clyde paddle steamer. She was built in 1931, as you know, but she had a major rebuild after the war, after her service as an anti-aircraft ship, and withdrawn in 1964, and then had another couple of seasons, 1966, 1967. So she had a 36-year career. And one tends to think of the Jeannie Deans, oh, well, you know, she was there forever. And she was there for 36 years, but there was a major rebuild in the middle of it. And then there are all the paddle steamers which never got rebuilt. Take the Marchioness of Lorne, built in 1935 for service on the Clyde. She was withdrawn in 1954, so she had a magnificent career of just 20 years, and then she was scrapped. I mean, that's like scrapping a paddle steamer built in 2002. The Bristol Queen, she was built in 1947 for Bristol Channel work, as we all know, withdrawn in 1967, so she had a career of just 21 years. No need for any rebuilds there. Although, having said that, she came to cousins in Weymouth in my childhood, 1962-63, the winter, for a major overhaul of her machinery and boiler, in which the boiler was retubed. So that boiler, built in 1947, was retubed in 1963. And perhaps worst of all was the Royal Eagle, built for service on the Thames in 1932 and withdrawn in 1949. So that's a career of just 18 years and only 12 years as an excursion steamer, unscrapped. So she was almost brand new when she was scrapped. And of course, we can't go by without talking about the lovely Swiss and their wonderful way with paddle steamers. We take this example of the Stadtluzern. All the paddle steamers in Switzerland have been rebuilt multiple times. The Stadtluzern, built in 1928 by the Sachsenburg-Blühle, she had in 1946 what they call a Haupt revision, a half revision, half rebuild. And then she had another of these Haupt revisions in 1961, and then a general revision, a major revision in 1985 to 1989, and then again another one, 2018 to 2021. So in the time that I've been going to Switzerland regularly since the 1980s, this paddle steamer has had a complete rebuild twice. And by a complete rebuild, as many of you will know, that means, stripping the ship back down to nothing and building it up again, taking all the decks off, putting new decks on, and so on. And all the Swiss paddle steamers, the latest, the Rhone, has just re-entered service in February this year. Okay, so what of KC? Well, she was built, as we know, in 1924, and she's now 98 years old. This is a very great age for a ship. And as we saw earlier, she's built with hull plates 6 millimeters and 8 millimeters thick. I mean, we're not looking at HMS Belfast here. I mean, HMS Belfast will last much longer than an excursion paddle steamer like KC, simply because she's starting out with thicker plates. And everything about KC is lightly constructed to keep the weight down and therefore to keep the draft down to get into topmess. In the operating years, we did quite a lot of work. I mean, she had work done on the Dart before we got her, and she had a first new boiler in 1961. All the work in the 1970s. But as an example of the lack of money in the 1970s and how it was sort of getting the ship ready to go rather than a full rebuild, around late 1980s, sometime around there, I was going around underneath with a chipping hammer, bang, 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 and my hammer went through the hull, which obviously not a good feeling. So anyway, we checked all around that area and put an insert in, but that set us off to doing major replating, which we did in 1991. The decks on KC, in the operating years, we renewed the lot, and some of them more than once. I mean, we found that some woods these days just don't last. We tried various woods. Douglas fir was probably one of the best, but that was a regular redoing. We put another new boiler in 2001, and we rebuilt the paddle boxes and the whole structure of the paddle boxes. We put new sponsons on, which were financed by a legacy. But we need to remember all of that actually is quite a long time ago now. I mean, the hull plate in 1991, that's 30 years ago. That's 5 years more than this 25-year magical lifetime of a ship. Much decking is 30 years ago, and that's a long time in the history of any ship. And nothing lasts forever. This is a picture taken in this rebuild. This is on the starboard sponson. The wood's all been taken off, and look at the state of some of the steel there. I mean, there's not much steel there in places. And this again illustrates this important point. You should always worry about what you can't see. And this is why, KC needs a rebuild. This is a section of the aft coach roof which has been taken off, and you can see how those really bits of wood attached to the bolts there. I mean, you can pick those off with your hand. But it's not all gloom. The aft coach roof was in terrible condition, and a lot of that crumbled as it came off. But the forward coach roof, we had that made only 2 or 3 years before she went to the Dart, so that's in good nick. And we're anticipating just lifting that off, redoing the steel underneath it, and then reattaching it. So as we've been working through the ship this winter, we've found some areas which are better than we might have expected, and some which are worse. Essentially, the plan of campaign is to renew all the steelwork as necessary, including the bulkheads. And most particularly the area where the hull meets the deck. That has never been renewed. So a lot of that's original, going back to 1924, and a lot of that is not in good nick. We're renewing all the decks throughout, and we're doing that in Douglas fir. And renewing every other thing that needs doing that we come across. And phase 1 this winter is from basically the paddle box to the stern, or from the engine room bulkhead, the boiler room bulkhead to the stern. Phase 2 next winter will be from the engine room bulkhead to the bow, and phase 3, which says phase 2, but it means phase 3, will be the engine room and the boiler room, with a target date to complete this by her centenary in 2024. And there's yard manager Richie James in the shed there, with some of the new decking, the Douglas fir decking on the left-hand side there. And on the right, in the right picture, and on the right-hand side of that picture, Richie's left hand, that is some of the wood which is going to be used for the margin planks around the outside. Getting quality wood is easier said than done. This has been specially imported, and a proportion of that was not good enough and had to go back, because what you don't want in wood really are knots and shakes. You want it free of knots and shakes, because the shakes have a tendency to leak in, and the knots come out in time and leave little dips in the deck. There's some of the new steel which has arrived. You can see, not very thick. And here's some progress on the ship. In the left-hand picture, some of the decking which has come off. And in the right-hand picture, we're in the aft saloon there, and there's bracing been put in to maintain the strength. And this is terribly important because she is so lightly constructed, because she has no binding superstructure. It's essential to try to keep that inherent strength in the ship and not let it sag and flop as you take things out. So you can see there the structure that has been built in on either side, back aft, to try to address that issue. And where decks have been taken up, try not to take all the decks up in one go, but to keep that strength in. There you can see the sponson in the left-hand picture with the and some of the steel work underneath the decking there is not in good nick. These extensive sponsons, I mean, Casey is obviously very different to the Waverley in that she has sponsons the whole length of the ship. And the commercial remit for that initially was to increase the passenger capacity, that you have this extra space to cram in your 500 passengers. And the Three Sisters had the poop deck back aft again to cram in the extra passengers. And having handled both the Waverley and KC, one key difference is that the Waverley is fended round her paddle box and fended round the stern, but nowhere else. Therefore, you don't want the bow to fall in on the Waverley and start hitting things because it's not fended. KC is fended the whole way round. I mean, the sponson extends almost from the stern to the bow, and both the sections which are outside the sponson, they're all fended too. So actually, KC is quite a hard boat to damage. You'd have to land pretty heavily to start doing serious damage to it. And these are pictures hot off the press from this morning. I was down there this morning. You can see in the right-hand picture there, the new steel above the level of the steel plating that we did in 1991, going on up to the deck. You can see the new steel there. And in the left, you're looking down on that. In the left-hand picture, we're standing just outside the engine room looking aft at the sponson on the left-hand side. So that and all the supports and beams in the aft saloon are being renewed. And when that's all done and we're putting a new steel deck down, which again will give a much more binding strength in the whole ship, then the woodworkers will get on with the decks. Well, I've come back now to my this Monarch slide that we looked at earlier on. Just a bit of the history of the Monarch. She was built in 1924 for the Southern Railway, and she was sold in 1950-51 to Cousins. So again, we're back to this magic figure of 25-ish years. Cousins found that when they bought her, she needed significant replating. But she wasn't rebuilt. The Consular Embassy and Emperor of India were all completely rebuilt after the war, major rebuilds. That didn't happen to the Monarch. They did this replating. She sailed from Bournemouth during the 1950s, predominantly running on the Swanage service, Bournemouth to Swanage. And then in 1959 to 60, she needed a new inner funnel. And that, again, is a good indication that if you don't do things to ships, it'll come up and bite you in due course. I mean, ships need rebuilding, they need work doing on them, and if not, it catches up anyway. And one just has to remember from the school of the blindingly obvious that steel rusts and wood rots as night follows day. In terms of the inner funnel, that was not renewed on KC during the 1970s, during the first restoration. And around 1990, I remember Chris Smith coming up to me and saying, "John, I think you ought to go and have a look at the inner funnel." So I put on my boiler suit and went down and went in through the smoke box at the front of the boiler and climbed up inside KC's funnel. And the inner funnel was just like a lace curtain. I mean, you could just pull bits out of it in your hand. And that is another part of a ship which is out of sight. Okay, so back to the KC project, the costs. Well, we are using some outside contractors, particularly for the steelwork, a local company that does a lot of work on ships and the fishing fleet at Brixton. Much of the work is being done in-house. And this is a good thing and a great benefit to KC in that commercial shipyard rates are astronomical. I think Paul was saying a couple of weeks ago, the guard was something like £48 per man hour. So we've got 2 men there, that's £100. It scales up very fast. Another advantage is that the in-house team are, I think, very good. I mean, they're very good crafts and skills there. It's difficult to be sure what the total cost of this is going to be because it does depend on what we find. If it needs doing, it's got to be done. If it doesn't need doing, then we won't do it. But our initial thoughts, the whole project is going to be at about £1 million, something like that. Phase 1 is currently looking at coming in around the 250,000 mark, maybe 300,000, something like that. And we'll have a clearer picture of the finances for phases 2 and 3 when we've got phase 1 under our belt. But as a broad brush stroke, we're looking at probably in excess of £1 million for this. We have the funding in place for phase 1, but we will need additional support for phases 2 and phase 3. And in that, we need to bear in mind that we do benefit from some partnership funding from the in-house work done by the Dart people who are doing stuff at cost price, not charging all wages and that sort of thing. So that is a major contribution, which if this rebuild was being done commercially in a commercial shipyard, would be costing us several arms and legs more. And the business case for the work is that KC has a sustainable business model at Dartmouth year on year. She's part of a fleet of passenger vessels operating in association with the steam railway. A paddle steamer makes a good fit with the steam railway. She's operating back in the home waters for which she was built. She's running the sort of length of cruises for which she was built and is best suited. There are crewing, steam, and maintenance skills in-house within the fleet and the steam railway. I mean, there are boiler making skills at Churston from the railway. They have now got an apprenticeship scheme going, and last summer, each of their apprentices came and spent a week on KC as part of their training with a view to trying to bring them on as potential KC engineers. And I think that we do qualify for that most important magical thing in fundraising, that KC has a proven and lengthy track record of delivering success and doing that without needing any external funding. We don't need any external funding except for this major work. KC doesn't require an operating subsidy. She washes her face in operating and annual maintenance costs, but she doesn't generate sufficient surplus to cover things like this major rebuild. And that's why we need help now to make sure that KC can continue to sail into the future, to offer the opportunity to sail back in time aboard a real steamship for future generations to enjoy. So that's our position. And of course, I've got to come back to my mentors, the Swiss, just in conclusion. It's a landlocked nation, and one tends to love, oh, what do the Swiss know about boats? You know, they're sitting in the middle of Europe. But as we all know, they have 18 operational paddle steamers running on 7 lakes. All of them have been rebuilt multiple times. They've got an unbroken tradition of captains and engineers. They've got a cost-effective operation. They've got small crews and a hinterland of support. I mean, I think the Rhone has been rebuilt at a cost of something like 13 million Swiss francs, and that's been financed by a combination of the Steamer Friends and money from the local cantons, as well as some from the operating company. And I just feel if they can do it, so can we. Why should they have 18 paddle steamers and we, a great maritime nation, be so sparse in this department? So, thank you for watching. And if you'd like to donate to help ensure Casey's long-term future, as I said earlier, you can donate through our website at get out your pens now, www.kingswearcastle.org, or you can send a check to Paddle Steamer Kingswear Castle Trust Fundraising at PO Box 9565 Weymouth 4HT. So that's me finished, but I'm very happy to answer questions. And I'm told by my technical experts here that you may be able to submit questions through the chat function on YouTube. So before I hand back to Murray to conclude the proceedings, if anyone has any questions and would like to tap them into the chat, and due to the miracles of science, these will be transmitted through the airwaves and will appear on my computer screen here, I'm told. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I love paddle steamers. Kingswear Castle has been a major part of my life, and it's been a real pleasure being involved in that. And we haven't got any questions so far, which is always a good thing. Maybe everyone's gone to sleep. Maybe they've stopped for tea.
Yeah, John, if you end your screen share.
I will. There we are. Something popped up there and it popped back down again. I think that was something from Jeremy Gold saying that this was an important talk, but that seems to have disappeared off my screen.
Yeah, there should be a wee window that says chat.
I haven't got a window with chats in at the moment. What do I need to press to make that happen? I wonder. Oh, chat. Oh, there we are. Oh, look, we got, this is wonderful. We've got lots of stuff. JM Gold, this is a very important talk covering aspects of paddle steamer maintenance and operation, which I have not seen covered anywhere else. I suggest it is vital that it be placed in the PSPS archive. Thank you, Jeremy. Also because changes in computer technology may mean that it becomes unplayable at some time in the future, it would be very beneficial if John's script can also be retained on paper. Goodness, I need to, my face is going red. Dick Clack says, how far have MCA requirements meant that upgrades have had to be built into the project? Well, the MCA have been involved in the project from the outset. Before we started off, we sat down with the MCA and our naval architect and went through our plans with them and addressed them. And I would say the MCA have been most helpful and most cooperative. We are not introducing stand at the moment any particular changes to KC's basic structure, except in light of things that we want to do, like enhance the basic structure of the ship by putting a steel deck onto which we then put thinner but normal wood decking on top of it, so you wouldn't notice that there's any steel underneath it. So I would say the MCA have been most cooperative, and my advice regarding the MCA is always, work with them. I mean, they can be difficult and they can be unhelpful, but I think it is terribly important establishing a rapport with the MCA. And one little minor tip, I remember, actually, I think it was Harry Quirk said to me back years ago, in those days, all of the regulations for class 3, 4, 5, and 6 passenger vessels were enshrined in 2 books called the Instructions for Guidance of Surveyors. Sadly, in the modern world, they've gone now and they've been replaced by online stuff. Personally, I think this online stuff is much harder to find details on, because these books, if you wanted to know anything about what the MCA or whatever they were called back then wanted, you looked it up in the index. If you wanted to know how many lavatories you'd have to build into a ship that ran on voyages of 30 minutes duration, you'd turn it up and you'd see. If you wanted to know how high the rails should be on a class 3 passenger vessel compared to a class 4 passenger vessel or class 6 passenger vessel, you just looked it up. I've still got them, they're wonderful books, and much of it is still the same, although obviously have been changes. And I think the modern world is much harder to find a lot of this stuff. And I think that that is a weakness, because surveyors also find it harder to find this stuff, because things are enshrined in M notices and such like. But just as one of the little tips of technique, I'm Harry Quirk saying, John, when you go into an MCA survey, or Department of Transport then was survey, and the surveyor's coming down, it's always a good idea to have those 2 books just sitting on the desk or underneath your arm. And it just sends out a signal that you take the trouble to know what the regulations are, and that if he or she makes a mistake, you know where to look it up and put them straight. It's a little thing. Martin Longhurst, can you explain the ownership and operating bodies? Yes. Well, Kingswear Castle is owned by the Paddlesema Kingswear Castle Trust, which is a registered charity, and it's a registered charity limited by shares for historical reasons. I mean, I don't believe you could set up a charity registered by shares these days, but for historical reasons, and because that's how it was, that's how it is, and that's all accepted. And the majority shareholder in the Paddlesema Kingswear Castle Trust is the Paddlesema Preservation Society. So it was the Paddlesema Preservation Society which routed to buyer and has been an underpinning driving force throughout, although the ownership of the ship has been in the hands of Paddlesema Kingswear Castle Trust and its predecessor, the same body but a different name, Paddlesema Navigation. So that is the ownership, and she is currently on charter to the Dart pleasure craft, which run the boats in association with the Dart Railway. Have I explained that well enough, Martin? Howard Bird. Thanks, John, for your support. And Howard Bird, I remember you were one of our crew members years ago on the Medway. We've had a lot of excellent crew members helping on KC over the years, and thank you, Howard, for still keeping an interest in us. Martin Longhurst has written, yes, it's important to note that KC is owned by a charity, the Paddlesema Kingswear Castle Trust, which is paying for the rebuild of our ship. But she is operated and maintained by the Dart Railway companies, which are not a charity. Although, having said that, they do plow a lot of money back into their business. I mean, I think also in terms of their current structure, whilst they are a very commercial concern, and I've got nothing wrong with a commercial concern, you want to be commercial to make sure that you generate revenues, etc. They do plow a lot back in to into the business. I mean, last year, for example, there was major work on the railway line near the level crossing by the hire ferry. That all had to be taken up and big piles driven down, etc. But yes, that's great. Kingswear Castle is owned by the Paddlesey Kingswear Castle Trust, which is a registered charity, and she is operated on our behalf by a commercial company, the Dart Company, which is contracted to run her, and they run her on our behalf, and they pay the operating costs and the maintenance costs up to a reasonable level. In the event of major works like this, then as it's our boat, we would look to find funding for that. Gregory Beecroft, what are you doing about future coal supplies? Will you have to change to timber pellets or other fuel? Well, John Jones, the general manager of the Dart Company, has been sourcing and buying in coal like there's no tomorrow. In fact, Paignton is full of coal, not only their normal coal pound, but every other available site has got coal in it. But yes, that's a very good point. I mean, what is going to happen to coal? What indeed is going to happen to anything in this strange world we currently live in? And of course, coal is not an attractive fuel now. I mean, I was standing on the quay at Dartmouth one day a couple of years ago, and there was a family there, and a little girl said Kingswear Castle was just leaving. And you usually hear nothing but positivity about KC when you're eavesdropping people's conversations. But there was this little girl saying, "Oh, look, Daddy, look at all the smoke that nasty paddle steamer is making." You know, that's the way of the world. So coal is not such a magical fuel now. We have been thinking about the possibility of using some other thing like these sort of pellets. And in fact, John Jones has been given some bags of some various stuff which we might look at trying. It needs to burn at the right sort of temperature. You don't need to burn too hot and burn out the fire bars. The best for the burning is a coal which burns nicely, produces some ash, which helps to insulate the fire bars, but not too much ash so it doesn't clog up the grate. We had one lot of coal after the deep navigation mine shut in, whenever that was, many years ago, which was so fierce, it produced very little ash, and it just burned out fire bars. We got through about 4 sets of fire bars in a season, as opposed to one set of bars going on for several years. But yes, coal may be an issue moving forward. We may not be able to get it. It might be too expensive. And it doesn't have that magical lure. And also, just in terms of the steam railway, you know, that's going past people's houses. People love steam railways. They still love steam railways, but you've only got to get 1 or 2 people saying, "Oh, we don't like that nasty steam train going past our house, polluting our washing or sending its fumes into our living room." And I feel that's the sort of world that one lives in, but I'm not sure one can do anything about that. Rosemary Bullen. I caught this lecture quite by chance. I'm a member of the PSPS Scottish branch and found it fascinating. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you. And John Carr, a splendid presentation. You mentioned the similarity of skills between maritime and railway engineering. Does the company have any difficulty in recruiting craftsmen, and are apprenticeships used? Well, the Dart Company does have a lot of expertise in-house with people both in woodworking skills and steelwork, and in steam. The railway has its own workshops at Churston, and that does now have an apprenticeship scheme, and they have got apprentices there. That's comparatively recent. I think last year was the first year of having a significant number of apprentices, and each of those apprentices did come down and spend a week on KC. I mean, I think one of the nice things about KC is that the crew is quite young, really. I mean, fairly young. I mean, the Captain Richie Swinglehurst is, I don't know how old he is, but probably 30s, late 30s, mid 30s, something like that. Dan Wheeldon, the engineer, ditto. So it is a new generation coming on, which for an old man like me on the way out is very pleasant to see. Well, that seems maybe to be it. And, no more questions. There we are. That's very definitive. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand you back over to Murray.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else have too. One thing that surprised me, if I may say so, is the fact that some of these vessels on the Dart carried cars at some time. And it's something I must admit I certainly didn't know, one of the many things. But if I can just, by way of giving a vote of thanks, say on behalf of everyone, it was an excellent talk, a superb evening, and you really dealt with the subject like no one else could, because after all, the KC is very much your baby, and it's thanks to you that it's here at all. So absolutely super. But if I can just go on and say that it really was quite fascinating, some of the things that, although the ships are of different types and different scale, that to Waverley, some things remain the same problems, like the wooden decks and the wasting of steelwork and all the rest of it, things that generally perhaps only come to light in the winter refits. And of course, Waverley's just about to go to dry dock, and KC is, well, effectively ending up the slipway anyway at the moment. And I think that certainly from a Waverley perspective, we very much envy you the facility that you have with a very friendly workforce, as opposed to the Garvel. And I'm not saying anything against the Garvel, but they're very much a commercial company, and they have done a good job in the past. But certainly, I think where you are with kindred spirits who are enthusiasts for it, I think the Waverley company, I think we're very envious of some of your relationships there. But anyway, a wonderful thing, two other similarities to say to you, we see that you have had people who are overly refreshed from time to time. We all need good passengers, but sometimes we can do without some of these events. And also like many others in the society, I have had the pleasure of sailing in the KC. I didn't manage to visit her on the Thames or the Medway, but have done now, firstly on an annual basis since she's come down to the Dart, and when we were on holiday down in Devon, and it's certainly one of the days that we set aside. And Dartmouth itself is very pleasant, and so far at least we've always been lucky with the weather. So we are coming back this year. I would be obliged if you can keep the weather as it has been before. But yes, well worth it for anyone. It's a long way away perhaps for some, but if you get the chance, go to Dartmouth and see for yourself the Kingswear Castle. Points taken from John about the need for funds. Waverley needs funds, Maid of the Loch needs funds, Sir Walter Scott needs funds. But the best way to support at the end of the day and get as much out of it, really, well, not that maybe the only way to support, but is to go and enjoy what it's all about. And John, you have given us a lot of pleasure this evening. Your photographs of the ship in operation have been superb, and it's been a very interesting narrative as to the restoration and the ongoing problems to do with the preservation. So on behalf of everyone who's watching this evening, I would just like to thank you very much, and I wish you well and the Kingswear Castle well in the season coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for watching.
Before we close down this evening, just to say that in the 3 weeks' time, on the 22nd of April, the Scottish branch will be having its AGM in Renfrew St Stephen's Church in Glasgow. And all are welcome to attend, and I hope that you will, because after we get the business out of the way, there will be some films shown, and I think these will provide an entertaining conclusion to the evening. So that's 22nd of April in Glasgow for the annual general meeting of the Scottish branch. And I hope that as many as possible will make the effort to be there, and I look forward to seeing you. So I think, Gordon, is there anything else need to cover? No, that's fine. So thanks very much again for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I wish you all a good evening. I look forward to seeing you in the future, and also on the PSPS 2 paddle steamers that are operational in the coming season. Thank you.
Thank you.